series of meetings on topical nonproliferation issues that the Center co-sponsors with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And the co-chair of the series, Dr. Joseph Pilat, is here today. On behalf of the Center, I just wanted to express our gratitude to Los Alamos for this collaboration, which is an important institutional partnership for us, for the support that they provide for this series. And the forum provides an opportunity for us to promote some cross-fertilization across different disciplines, social sciences, public policy communities, as well as through Los Alamos, a deeper reach for the Center into the science and technology community. So we're welcome all of you today. The series will meet again in December and then on into 2009. Notices of the future meetings are forthcoming. Today's topic is Deterrence to and through Zero, Challenges of Disarmament and Proliferation. We're very pleased to welcome to the Center Christopher Ford. Ambassador Ford, pardon? I'm sorry. I thought someone was directing a question to me. Ambassador Ford was the former U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation, currently at the Hudson Institute. With that, let me turn the floor over to Joseph Pilat, who will introduce our speaker and also tee up today's topic. Joe.
Thank you, Rob. Let me offer a welcome from Los Alamos National Laboratory as well as from me personally. With the recent calls from luminaries like George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn for a world without nuclear weapons, there's clearly growing interest in and hopes for nuclear disarmament expressed in governments and non-governmental organizations around the world. While the specific proposals of the so-called Four Horsemen can be fully discussed without raising any of the issues concerning nuclear disarmament that we have understood since the beginning of the nuclear age, it appears their vision is changing today's debate. It remains uncertain how this increased interest will manifest itself, but thinking about a nuclear-free world requires thinking about political, military, and technical feasibility. Would a world without nuclear weapons be more stable and secure? Will deterrence disappear, and if so, with what consequences? What are the conditions in which nuclear weapons might be eliminated? How could we ensure that nuclear weapons were given up? Is it effectively verifiable? And can compliance be assured? Finally, how will we deal with virtual capabilities, with the reality that nuclear weapons can't be disinvented and could be reconstituted by states that possess them, or by states with nuclear energy programs, or even a modest technical capability? These and other issues about the path forward and the shape of a nuclear-free world need to be addressed. To provide a framework for thinking about a nuclear-free world from the vantage of the current international security environment, and to identify some of the key issues and challenges that must be addressed if we are to move closer to such a world, we're fortunate to have Christopher Ford with us today. As Rob noted, he is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He served as recently as September 2008 as the United States Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation, where he headed all U.S. diplomatic efforts related to the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. His NPT diplomacy was, in many ways, revolutionary. He raised the issue of disarmament openly for the first time in years in U.S. public policy. Before this diplomatic post at the state, he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Verification, Compliance, and Implementation. He earlier served as Minority Counsel and then General Counsel to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and had previous service on various Senate committee staffs. He served as intelligence officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve for 13 years, rising to the rank of Lieutenant Commander. He's the author of The Admiral's Advantage, U.S. Navy Operational Intelligence in World War II and the Cold War, and a forthcoming study on Chinese conceptions of international order since the time of Confucius. He
Buy it.
he is. I could go on with this bio, but I think you want to hear him speak. Chris.
Thanks, Joe. I thank you for a very generous introduction. And let me also thank both Drs. Litvak and Pilat for their hospitality and generosity in having me here. It's a great opportunity to talk. As those of you who know me will not be surprised to hear, I'm always delighted to have the chance to engage and have these kinds of discussions with folks. It's a wonderful opportunity. You guys do tremendous work, and you're in different but marvelously complementary institutions, and it's something that is very valuable, and I'm grateful for the chance to be here. I have, as it ended up about 3 o'clock this morning, the paper that I prepared for today is absurdly long and far too much so for delivery here. I've cut it down just a few points for oral delivery. I do have a whole pile of copies for those who are interested in the extended dance mix, and I will hand that out afterwards. Any of my former State Department colleagues here will not be surprised that I overwrote, but hopefully, at least in this context, it will be to people's advantage rather than a colossal pain for the interagency clearance loop to handle. Let me cut to the chase with respect to disarmament issues and this what I think of as the challenge of deterrence to and through zero, by saying at the outset that in my view at least, a world free of nuclear weapons would indeed be in the United States' best interest. In that regard, I'm no opponent of nuclear disarmament, and I do support it as a genuine U.S. policy goal. That said, lest you think I'm saying more than I actually am, I should point out that it is not the same thing. That is not the same thing as saying that just any world free of nuclear weapons would be in our interest, or indeed in the interests of international peace and security more generally. Details, I think, matter, and they matter a lot. As I suggested to a conference in Japan last year, disarmament's proponents, at least most of them that one hears, have yet to make a compelling case that getting rid of nuclear weapons is a per se good thing. In my view, disarmament advocates still need to show that no world, and I'll have to phrase this carefully, make sure I don't get it wrong, they still need to show that no world with nuclear weapons would be preferable in terms of global stability and international peace and security to any world without them. My own suspicion is that this cannot, in fact, be demonstrated, and that therefore, while some hypothetical future worlds without nuclear weapons would clearly be greatly preferable to our own, there are some that clearly would not be. One foreign diplomat of my acquaintance has joked to me, and as far as I know, he's only joked privately, so you won't be able to tell who this is. Scott probably knows who it is. That we must be careful lest we make the world safe once again for large-scale conventional war. And he's got a point. It's not obvious that history would thank us for trading the world of 2008 for a world that looked a little bit more like, say, 1914 or 1939. I hope that such a trade-off would not have to be made, of course, and it may well not have to be made. But the point remains that responsible present-day decision-makers need to have more confidence about precisely where nuclear disarmament would take us than can be provided merely by the tautological observation that we are aiming for a world free of nuclear weapons. We need to remember that despite its almost totemic significance to many proponents, disarmament itself isn't the goal. Rather, the common objective should be a safer, more secure, and more livable world. Not every imaginable scenario without nuclear weapons would in fact be an improvement from this perspective. So if disarmament is to proceed, we need to be confident that we are on the road to creating one of the good scenarios as opposed to one of the bad ones. If such confidence isn't possible, we may need to content ourselves with a sort of suboptimal best available world in which there remain at least some nuclear weapons in at least somebody's hands. So let me briefly survey the landscape in terms of my impressions, having worked this issue on the diplomatic circuit for a couple of years. Is disarmament really saleable to today's current weapons possessors? It's not clear. Among the possessor states, disarmament, specifically nuclear disarmament, I should say, is perhaps easiest to contemplate from the United States perspective. For in both absolute and relative terms, we would give up the least in terms of concrete military advantage or in any kind of more intangible geopolitical status, if you will, by the elimination of nuclear weapons. unless we become weak and complacent in some kind of foolish tumble away from international engagement as a kind of controversy, timid and risk-averse sort of post-Bush backlash or something, the U.S. will continue for the foreseeable future to have plenty of non-nuclear military power upon which to rely when we feel that our security interests or the interests of peace and security more generally require that kind of muscle. It presumably means something that U.S. officials have been willing in recent years to recommit themselves to the eventual achievement of nuclear disarmament, and that they've begun talking candidly about those issues. It seems safe to say that if the Bush administration, which has already been accelerating the pace of U.S. nuclear weapons dismantlement, has proven willing to engage in serious and detailed discussions of this sort, then perhaps the ground isn't so sterile after all. By way of corroborating evidence, it's also worth pointing out, those of you who have been following the news in the past year or so, that there have been no trivial number of sort of embarrassing incidents of U.S. military sloppiness and inattention when it comes to their nuclear weapons missions. One might infer from that the U.S. military is already thinking of nuclear weapons as sort of a passé sort of thing. A study by James Wirtz that appeared recently in a book edited by Dr. Alagapa phrased it something along the lines of how Curtis LeMay must be turning in his grave. It's clear that from the perspective of the U.S. military, what the nuclear weapons people are today engaged in is, frankly, at best, a tertiary mission. That is a revolutionary development, and we should not ignore its significance. So the U.S., I think, on the whole, perhaps could be persuaded to take disarmament very seriously indeed, and zero may not be entirely out of the question from Washington's perspective. Now, as I said before, not every nuclear weapons-free world would likely be felt to be in U.S. interests. That's certainly true. But some surely would. And if some such good scenario could be shown to be realistically achievable, then Washington might be willing to go along, or even perhaps to lead the way. Okay, that's where the easy part stops. In part because an American willingness to move in that direction would only be a mixed blessing for the disarmament community, frankly. I think to some extent, too, it's the very fact that the U.S. military has the ability to continue as a creditable strategic deterrent force in the absence of nuclear weapons is one of the reasons that may, in fact, make other nuclear weapons states much more unwilling to consider that possibility. It sounds like there's a sort of a confounding tension, in a sense. What would make the most powerful and important nuclear weapons possessor today willing to consider disarmament is precisely the same thing that might perhaps make its colleagues amongst the other possessors less willing to do so. And it's not clear to me how disarmament's advocates may propose to bridge that tension. So that's a challenge. Turning to the UK, a very interesting case. At present, the Brits seem reasonably serious about moving toward disarmament, and one can hardly contest that London has less obvious a need for nuclear weapons than it once did. We've heard British diplomats like Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett at Carnegie here a little over maybe a year and a half ago break some interesting new ground in calling for disarmament and for proposing concrete laboratory work toward that end. We heard Des Brown at the Conference on Disarmament last February make the same kind of comments from the perspective of his role as Secretary of Defense over there. Conceivably zero is in fact saleable for the UK, but I don't know. It remains an open question in my mind, at least, in light of for example, of the so-called old Labour rebellion in the Commons that accompanied the Trident decision over a year ago. It's an open question to me the degree to which Britain's enthusiasm for disarmament in diplomatic fora these days represents a genuine strategic commitment to the idea, or whether it represents, to some extent, sort of intra-party Labour damage mitigation and symbolic posturing. It could be both. These are not inconsistent. So I don't know the extent to which those factors play out against each other. And to the extent that it's the latter, then one might question whether any enthusiasm for disarmament would in fact carry over to a potential conservative government in a however long from now that might take place. Certainly the Trident decision itself suggests the UK is thinking in terms of nuclear weapons for quite a bit longer, at any rate. French President Sarkozy has recently revealed additional French nuclear weapons reductions, which has been generally hailed in the disarmament community, but as something of a mixed blessing, because he did so, as you may recall, in a speech to dock workers when he was receiving the delivery of their most recent ballistic missile submarine, the fourth of the class, and which, of course, itself represents a significant French commitment to nuclear deterrence for the foreseeable future. Conceivably, it might be saleable somehow to France in the future. I don't know, but they certainly approach the issue already much more warily than the other two countries I've been speaking about so far. And it has to be said that if Russia's, sort of increasing revanchiste chest beating continues in Europe, that you're going to probably see the Europeans as a whole get a little bit more cagey about getting rid of their strategic deterrence. So that doesn't seem to be moving in the right direction either. China is a very interesting, to me, and ambiguous case, not just because I've become something of a obsessive about China issues with my recent book that I've just finished revising. It's consistent with the powerful strain in Chinese political culture that regards virtue in a sort of grand moral sense as being closely related to and sort of structurally and causally connected to political power. China has been very keen to present itself as a virtuous player in the international arena. It's been keen to do this, perhaps especially where its conduct would otherwise appear to be, in some respects, crudely self-aggrandizing. It's very important that to leaders in Beijing that they maintain this sort of image, this self-image and self-proclaimed role as the only real champion of disarmament among the so-called N5, nuclear 5 states. Beijing has long claimed to support complete nuclear disarmament, and it has stridently propounded what it says is a no-first-use policy. At the same time, China is working hard to modernize its nuclear forces, and while others have been making dramatic reductions in recent years, it is certainly true also that China is apparently the only member of the N5, in fact, to be building up its nuclear forces. So there's an odd ambivalence there. From a disarmament perspective, despite that sort of dubious status as being the only builder up, and by the way, that may help explain their position on the fissile material cutoff treaty in Geneva, if you should be curious, but that's a matter simply for speculation on my part. It's presumably a good sign, at least, that Beijing does not appear interested in a full-scale arms race with anybody. We should be thankful for that. Chinese policy seems to be, at the moment, limited to using disarmament rhetoric in diplomatic fora in order to try to induce the Americans and the Russians to reduce their arsenals further, even while Beijing slowly and quietly, at the same time, builds up its own arsenal. Just how far the Chinese intend to build their arsenal is an open question. Some have argued that China hopes to follow sort of a minimum deterrence strategy that calibrates its arsenal somehow on the basis of what is estimated to be needed simply to deter attack at the most fundamental level by some other power. But what minimum means, of course, is anybody's guess, and it presumably means different things under different circumstances over time. So exactly where this goes is probably not even knowable or even necessarily predicted in Beijing itself. At the moment, Beijing seems happy enough with a fairly slow rate of growth, coupled with efforts to modernize and improve survivability. U.S. intelligence analysis, open source, declassified NIEs have estimated that the ballistic missile force will increase several-fold over the next few years, and will include a sizable ICBM force targeted primarily at the United States. Read in conjunction with China's longstanding push for nuclear disarmament to reduce other countries' nuclear arsenals, one might suspect that, and this is my own view, that Beijing's real goal is to achieve at least parity with the nuclear superpowers, yet without provoking an arms race, by which I mean building quietly and steadily up toward the reduced armament levels, down to which international disarmament pressures are hoped to push Moscow and Washington. Interestingly, Chinese officials have essentially said as much, at least privately. One diplomat at one point in one of my previous incarnations indicated when I asked him about this that, frankly, China isn't interested. This is not a quote, by the way; it's a paraphrase. But China isn't interested in talking about slowing its own strategic development, much less disarming, until at least the point at which it has reached parity with a presumably reducing United States. And frankly, he made no warranties about what would happen even then. In reality, therefore, Chinese strategic policymaking doesn't seem to be too concerned about nuclear disarmament in itself, except inasmuch as propounding such disarmament is useful at present in furthering China's return to the position of geopolitical status that the Middle Kingdom seems to feel is its birthright. Disarmament is therefore a tool to facilitate China's rise vis-a-vis the other great powers, rather than necessarily for developing a safer and more secure international environment in the way that we might consider it here in the U.S. So don't hold your breath for zero anytime soon from Beijing's perspective. I won't talk much about Russia because, frankly, one doesn't need to. They've been increasing their reliance upon nuclear weapons. They brag about how many tactical weapons they have. They have extraordinary sort of Cold War-era, semi-paranoiac conceptions of foreign encirclement. and in a largely dysfunctional, still conventional military force. Nuclear weapons are going to be central to where the Russians are for the foreseeable future. So, they're the toughest case of all, I think, among the five from a disarmament perspective. Let me not dwell at length on other actual or potential possessors. I talk about them a little bit in the paper, but let me simply quote a recent study that book that I was actually sent to review, which was quite good. It's called The Long Shadow. I do recommend it to people. Which makes the point that from the perspective, it looks specifically at countries in Asia, but as this recent study suggests, nuclear weapons are, if anything, felt to retain or to have even more security relevance for many countries today than before, particularly as what is described as sort of foundational insurance in situations of conventional military imbalance and what was termed the sort of as bedrock weapons of the weak for countries with existential security concerns. One way of translating that is that outside the N5, who presumably don't have much in the way of existential security concerns, nuclear weapons are considered, frankly, more relevant than ever in many quarters around the world. Again, don't hold your breath for zero anytime soon. As the case of Israel might be seen to suggest, I should also add that no serious discussion of the prospects of disarmament can ignore the challenge of proliferation. N5 disarmament, or Israeli denuclearization for that matter, will probably only ever be conceivable, if it is, if the international community is able to provide very, very solid assurances against proliferation to new countries, such as Iran. What country, after all, could be persuaded to give up its last nuclear weapons if it could not be confident that the system, whatever the system is, would be able to prevent nuclear arsenals from appearing in new hands? So it's hard to see the international community's rather uninspiring track record with respect to multilateral efforts to rein in countries like North Korea and Iran as anything other than profoundly damaging, if not crippling, to hopes for disarmament. But perhaps there's room still to improve that record. It's an open question. I talk in my paper about challenges of verification, and some of the things get rather technical. I hope I don't put a foot too far wrong. I'm sure my lab colleagues will correct any misstatements that I make, but I'm going to skip over that verification stuff right now. Suffice it to say that in my view, at least, there are many challenges to verifying in any reasonably useful way a disarmament regime. I try to talk about them in the paper, and if anybody has any thoughts about that after I've passed this out at the end of my remarks, please don't hesitate to get back to me. I love engagement and feedback with people, and building ongoing conversations about this on multiple axes sounds like a lot of fun. So please, I would welcome feedback, especially on the technical stuff, because it is not an area of my personal background and training. I'm relatively new to it. So skipping a long section on those issues, and I'll also skip the fairly self-evident stuff on compliance enforcement. Let me just say on that Frederick Clay got it quite right in 1961 when he drew attention to the challenge of after detection, what? I mean, what's the point of detecting a violation if nothing happens upon detection? The purpose of a verification regime is to facilitate collective action and effective remedial action, I should say, in the face of an attempted violation. If you want disarmament to succeed, you need to not only provide a very robust verification regime from the detection perspective, but you have to feed the input, or the output, I should say, of that regime into something that is in fact meaningful and deterring for would-be proliferators in terms of the ability of the regime to take action to in some way to make it not worth people's while to attempt to achieve breakout. So, we're a long way from cracking that nut too. Let's just put it that way. Now let me move into the idea of deterrence at and through zero that is really sort of the main focus of what I'd like to sort of toss out for you guys today. It's certainly easy to spell out a long laundry list of the difficulties that face disarmament. I don't want to be too much the pessimist, although it's easy to be, in part because I'm not certain that it can't be done. If there's some possibility that this can be achieved in a way that improves the world, then failing to even consider the possibility will pretty much guarantee we never get there. So it's worth it's worth keeping after this, however daunting it might seem. It's also worth remembering that the world is a hell of a complex place. It's pretty good at defying our expectations over time, and I certainly don't want to rule out that there will be some kind of fortuitous global transforming something that will make a future potentially disarmed and stable, peaceful world as possible, but as possible, notwithstanding how surprising it might seem to us now, in the same way that the end of the Cold War rivalry and the amazing reductions in nuclear forces that have taken place between the United States and Russia would presumably seem amazing to someone plucked out of, say, 1983. So, I never say never, but we should also remember that hope is not a strategy, and it's inadequate for the disarmament community simply to assume that somehow this transforming something will occur. We got to have to work for this one if it's there. I think if any of you have read Nassim Taleb's book on Black Swan, unpredictable events, Black Swan events can be good too, but I think we should both bear in mind that they are unlikely. Which is the pessimistic, into the glass half empty interpretation. But from the glass half full side, it is incumbent upon a serious leader and decision maker to be prepared for the sort of conceptual and psychological agility that would let one take advantage of any such unforeseen, unpredictable, potentially transformative event, should it occur. Will it occur? Who knows? But if it does, we'd be well advised to be ready to take advantage of it. Otherwise, one will simply have squandered extraordinary opportunities. So let me talk a little bit about game theory, though I'm not an expert on it. I'm very interested in the challenge not just of getting to zero, but of staying at zero. And it strikes me that the process of getting to zero will itself increase the challenges of staying at zero for some fairly elementary reasons. Reducing the number of nuclear weapons in the world and ultimately bringing that number to zero, in my view, would in fact increase the strategic value, I think it's fairly clear, would increase the strategic value of possessing a small sort of entry-level nuclear arsenal. From that perspective, disarmament would increase the apparently already dangerously powerful incentives for nuclear proliferation. With reduced overall numbers, the marginal value of even a few weapons becomes very great. I think it may in fact be that far from having the nuclear weapon states failure completely to disarm be a contributor to proliferation, as is often alleged, this sort of game theory perspective might suggest, in fact, that U.S. and Russian reductions may in fact have made proliferation more attractive overall. At overall numbers close to zero, at the asymptote, after all, even the most modest arsenal would be sort of a strategic game changer in many respects. It would make even a very modest weapons acquirer into something of a strategic peer with the greatest of the countries of the world, and the most powerful of the countries in the world. At that asymptote, weapon one, as I think of it, is quite a strategic coup indeed. The first weapon introduced into a disarmed world is a game changer of quite enormous implications. I think of this as sort of the August 1945 problem. Frankly, disarmament exacerbates the pressures for proliferation from that perspective, because as nuclear weapons reductions continue and zero approaches, the very success of disarmament increases the incentives for others to cheat. So if you're going to build a regime that is intended to keep the world at zero, you need to provide very, very solid assurances that you can deter and, if necessary, respond to attempts at breakout in such a way as to make them fundamentally unattractive. There's very little margin for error if you're talking about potentially giving, pick the government that you dislike of your choice, potentially giving that government, the only nuclear weapons in the world. So that's a huge challenge. How is it that disarmament can deal with that? I talk about a couple of ways of thinking about this, sort of in passing in the paper as a way to lead up to my main point at the end. But let me just say quickly that I think it is important that in thinking about this, we refuse to fall for the temptation to simply assume that there'll be some kind of a deus ex machina of an emboldened Security Council that will miraculously ride to the rescue if there happens to be an attempted breakout. I mean, maybe that'll be the case. That would be great. Banking on that, like I said, hope is not a strategy. Banking on that strikes me as being rather foolish. Particularly given the unimpressive track record of multilateralism in dealing with challenges like Iran and North Korea so far. I've said this in office, and I think I would say it even more stridently now. I think that the realistic hopes for disarmament may require developing a conception of deterrence in a nuclear weapons-free world that channels the natural and structural incentives of nation-state participants themselves towards balancing behaviors that would, in effect, serve to deprive a would-be breaker out of some or all of the strategic gains that it might otherwise hope to achieve. I think there may be some ways to do that. I'll talk about one in particular, which I think is kind of intriguing, and which I raised I don't know, it was the spring of 2007 when I was in my previous job. quite apart from other ways to do this, one of the pieces of the puzzle may, in fact, be something that I've termed countervailing reconstitution. I think it's important to consider all sorts of ways of trying to stay at zero, and this may be, in fact, one. Let me back up a little bit to explain the concept. There's been much concern raised in recent years about the danger of countries acquiring fissile material production capabilities that would give them a kind of nuclear weapons option, if you will. Sort of, I think El Baradei calls it a virtual nuclear weapons program. Usually this issue of virtual weapons programs is regarded as a profound challenge to the nonproliferation regime, and that's because it is. It's a very scary thought that lots of countries might, in fact, in future scenarios, have the ability to produce nuclear weapons more or less on demand. Okay, ask the inspectors not to come back on Thursday, have a bomb on Friday. I mean, things could get very dicey in that respect. These concerns are very real. That was a slight exaggeration, by the way. But my the safeguards mavens in the room will get all over me if I let things like that stand. But those concerns, of course, are very real, and they've been an important part of the underpinning of U.S. policy in recent years. But let me suggest that there may be at least one way, at least in which this sort of an idea of a nuclear weapons option could perhaps contribute to in stabilizing ways as opposed to destabilizing ways. I think a disarmament regime might perhaps be able to rely to some extent upon this idea of countervailing reconstitution to convince today's weapons possessors, first of all, that it's safe for them to go to zero in the first place, and secondly, to convince anyone who might be contemplating breakout in a disarmed world that it would be very difficult for them to realize any significant strategic gains from such a step. This idea of countervailing reconstitution, at least as I have come across it, in a sense grows out of what the U.S. is already doing under the Bush administration. At present, hopefully I won't cross any lines in saying this, the United States, I should say, maintains some undisclosed number of nuclear warheads more than it feels it actually needs, in a sense, at the moment. It does this in part out of concerns about potential future changes in the strategic threat. Should some new threat develop that leads planners to think they need more weapons than they had previously thought they needed, having those on hand would enable that sort of difference to be met to some extent. Under the Bush administration, a program was begun or accelerated to modernize the U.S. nuclear weapons complex by making it more responsive, I think is the code word for that, which is to say capable of swiftly resuming nuclear weapons production if need be. Coupled with these improvements, the U.S. stockpile is in fact being reduced, in part because planners have decided that it is no longer necessary to rely to as great an extent upon maintaining that sort of slightly larger stock of existing weapons than you think you need. In other words, the potential to meet a future threat can be made up increasingly by the capability of resumed production rather than by having more of these things sitting on the shelf. And you can't do that without a responsive production infrastructure, of course, because if you didn't have as many as you think you needed and you couldn't produce them, you're sort of screwed if there's a new threat. But the idea is that with a responsive infrastructure, you can, at least by that margin, further reduce the arsenal. That's already happening. Now, the countervailing reconstitution idea sort of takes that logic a step further. What if in a disarmed world, at least some of today's possessor states had a easily reconstitutable turnkey production capability? What would that mean? It would present certainly some verification challenges and some other challenges, which I talk about in the paper but won't dwell upon here. But from the perspective of providing a potential deterrent to someone contemplating breaking out, it may be very useful indeed. First of all, countervailing reconstitution, CR, as I like to call it, might enable, as I indicated before, present-day weapons possessors to feel comfortable in going to zero in the first place, because they would have some ability to restart production if someone else were discovered to be cheating. Irreversibility is sort of a talismanic thing in the disarmament community, but my suggestion is, in fact, that reversibility may perhaps have some utility that we should not rule out just because the word scares us. Secondly, countervailing reconstitution may help deter breakout, and that's its most important function, I suppose, over the long term, from a disarmament regime, thus helping ensure its survival, notwithstanding the fact that the very achievement of disarmament would vastly increase the incentives for proliferation, incentives to cheat. It would do this by putting violators on notice, or would-be violators, I should say, on notice that that any violation, I should say, would quickly be countered and presumably more than offset by the reconstitution of weapons stockpiles in one or more of today's possessor countries. In effect, the message of CR would be for potential violators, it's not worth your while. If you try to build some, we'll jump back in the business and either flatly outcompete you or at least vitiate whatever advantage over us you might have hoped to achieve by breaking out. Now, Perkovich and Acton, in their very insightful recent Delphi paper, do discuss this idea. Actually, they quote me on CR, which is kind of fun. But they talk about, and they raise some real questions about countervailing reconstitution, which I don't mean to dismiss. I don't regard this as a sort of deterrent, post-disarmament deterrent panacea. At best, it's only one answer to a partial answer to only one problem that would be facing a disarmament regime. But it's something I think we probably shouldn't rule out. It needs to be part of the mix as we consider the conceptual toolkit that would need to be applied to a disarmed world. Now, this brings me to my sort of overall conclusion, and I'm sorry to have taken so long, but believe it or not, this really was 22 single-space, 2-column pages in 10-point font. So it's a lot shorter than it might have been. You may think, having heard me go through a lot of these challenges, and to suggest as a potential solution to some of them something that is presumably anathema to most of the disarmament community, namely keeping Los Alamos shrink-wrapped and ready to go with all the scientists sitting around waiting by their computers for the go order. That presumably won't be received very well from a lot of the folks who usually talk about nuclear disarmament. And I, in the paper especially, lay out a lot of, frankly, very, very formidable difficulties that would face any serious effort to achieve nuclear disarmament. Lest you conclude that I am an opponent of disarmament, however, let me just make the point that merely identifying those challenges is not the same thing as opposing the project. In fact, as I've said elsewhere, quoting some other people, not myself, it's phrasing better than I could come up with, but the true friend of disarmament can't just be its flatterer. The case of disarmament needs to have these difficulties pointed out to it, no matter how painful it may be. And frankly, the more painful, the more important it is to point them out. Without honesty about these challenges, it can hardly ever hope to overcome them. And so I would think that both skeptics and proponents ought to be able to agree that these problems need to be far better understood. Given the nature of the daunting challenges, however, I think intellectual honesty and basic prudence counsel us to at least be alive to the possibility that it wouldn't be achievable. And considering that probably requires admitting that the international community's conceptual toolkit for dealing with the challenges of living in stable relationships of nuclear deterrence. This is a toolkit, by the way, grounded in sort of the comparatively simple game theory dynamics and mathematics of two-party bipolar confrontations. That toolkit is, I fear, hopelessly inadequate for coping with the 21st century world. It's not merely that deterrence will have a greater number of players in the future. I mean, indeed, there already are more than 2 players, of course. For the moment, however, while the U.S. and the Russian arsenals remain so big, other relationships sort of are not exactly lost in the noise, but they're certainly secondary or tertiary. But as numbers come down, that's going to change, and something more like parity among a fairly large number of actors would obtain. And frankly, we don't really have a very good way to conceptualize or deal with that. Reasoning based on game theory has been hugely important in the past to U.S. nuclear strategy, for instance. But I think such approaches really have yet to be updated adequately, if at all, in search of lessons for dealing with multiplayer games, played simultaneously on multiple axes. My suspicion is that these kinds of bipolar conceptual models will be inadequate. To quote Alagapa again, asymmetry is now the defining condition and the basis for strategic thinking in nearly all nuclear weapon states. I think that's accurate. China, for example, deters the U.S. by means of a much smaller nuclear force. Israel deters potential adversaries with merely the implication of nuclear weapons. And frankly, at least until such point as the Americans and Russians go further in disarming, even nuclear-on-nuclear deterrence relationships are going to be characterized by very interesting dynamics of asymmetry for quite some time. Nor is nuclear-on-nuclear, like-on-like deterrence the end of the story. I think, we can't afford to analyze tomorrow's or today's really complex multiplayer problems through that lens only of nuclear-on-nuclear, like-on-like deterrence. Already in today's world, the United States hopes to deter WMD use in large part by relying upon non-nuclear forces and the threat of its overwhelmingly awe-inspiring conventional military power. Japan deters China in part through an alliance relationship with no nuclear weapons in Japanese hands at all. and nonproliferation experts worry about the potential for virtual nuclear weapons capabilities in a growing number of countries, affecting stability and deterrent relationships around the world. Clearly, the equation is not just limited to nuclear on nuclear. We need to be considering all kinds of counterpoised, overlapping, asymmetric complexities that we frankly don't have the conceptual paradigm that lets us even frankly adequately describe, much less model in a useful way. So there's a whole lot of work to be done on this, and I think it's incredibly important. Any serious conceptual paradigm for 21st century strategic policy needs to learn how to embrace asymmetry, needs to come to grips with the challenges presented by that kind of complexity. We aren't there yet. We don't have the tools to think about it, and we are almost certainly going to need to. And I should say that this is not something on which the disarmers can claim to be let off the hook, because these dynamics are going to be incredibly important, at the very least until such point as zero is reached, and very probably in an unlike on unlike sense with respect to how it is that one would deter potential nuclear weapons acquisition in a non-nuclear weapons world. These dynamics will probably continue to dominate the international arena for Lord knows how long. And if we don't learn how to ride that wave, we're going to have an awful lot of trouble dealing with the world that confronts us. That was much too much to say in a very short time, but I'm grateful for the indulgence, and I will actually, why don't I just hand out paper copies of this now, because conceivably people flipping through it might actually, there's a bunch of stuff in here that I haven't brought up. That might be useful, but I'd be delighted to jump into Q&A and talk until they kick me out of the building. So let me pass this around. Thanks. Send that around that way.
Thank you, Chris. We will open the floor to questions. There's a lot on the table. Please identify yourself and your institution. Yes.
Henry Hetker, researcher at NARA. I wondered about, yesterday's news, Russia deploying rockets into Kaliningrad to counter the Polish anti-missile system. I wondered what your thoughts on this. Is this like what you talked about as CR or some new situation or problem in disarmament that can destroy all kinds of negotiations where people were previously quite hopeful?
I think it's... Well, should we do this in like one at a time then? Okay, cool. Sorry, people vary in how they organize this stuff. My apologies. It's clearly it's hardly good news. I'm not sure it has the kind of strategic significance that the Russians would like everyone to think that it has. It probably is. My own view is that it has more sort of political and emotive significance than anything else, and may in fact be very powerful. One of the Russian games, it seems to me, over these recent couple of years of missile defense struggles has been one of political positioning in terms of trying to divide us from our allies. And frankly, from my own conversations with Russian officials in office, I'm convinced that at the end of the day, Moscow doesn't, in fact, regard anything that we are in any likelihood at all of deploying in Europe as being anything like a threat, or even our BMD as a whole, frankly, because what it would take to make that a credible defensive shield against the kinds of attacks that they can present is just unimaginably difficult for the United States to get up the moxie to deploy at this point. So I don't frankly suspect that they think it's that threatening in their heart of hearts, but it is awfully useful and awfully fun to play us off against our allies, create rifts within the North Atlantic Alliance, and to posture as a sort of revived great power for them. I've had Russian officials tell me to my face that look, we don't. This is before the third site stuff. Look, we understand this poses no threat to us. Just don't surprise us. We don't want to wake up in the morning and find interceptors actually deployed. But if we know this is coming, it's no big deal. That was then. This is now. It's apparently much more entertaining to make the world cringe and to pretend that you have returned to the status of a superpower in the way that they feel in their hearts they wish to be. I don't know how much to credit it. It's certainly not a good thing to have missiles in Kaliningrad if indeed that ends up happening. Its impact will probably be much more political than military. And Russia has long retained the ability to nuclearly vaporize any country that it wishes with its intercontinental force, far or near, for quite some time. The world is quite used to that. From one perspective, it would be very hard to argue that this makes a lot of difference in a sort of game theoretical sense. It probably has political impact. It's intended to. It probably will have an impact upon diplomatic discussions about so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons. There's this undercurrent that you hear in diplomatic fora about, well, why don't we get rid of all the so-called tactical weapons in Europe? I mean, my own view on that, and this is entirely my own view, just for the record, is that from a sort of military and strategic perspective, U.S. weapons in Europe don't perform much of a purpose in a military sense. They perform a very important purpose in terms of continued the symbolic coupling, as the jargon goes, of the transatlantic alliance. Frankly, that's why, I mean, from a U.S. perspective, my suspicion is that if it were just up to us, we would have had them out of Europe, the few that remain, a long time ago. It is, however, very important to the Europeans, precisely because of the symbolic coinage of that coupling that has always been a part of how it is that the alliance regards itself as a stable, coherent, and enduring entity since the days of the Cold War. It is, ironically, the European governments that have begged us to keep the missiles there over time and have not always been very happy when we have reduced them. And which makes it very ironic that so many European foreign ministries seem to like to castigate us for the issue of so-called tactical weapons. Their ministries of defense and their prime ministerial and presidential offices may have a different perspective, and usually do, but that's a matter for complicated internal alliance dynamics, not for public discussion, I suppose. So, I mean, I think that the political dynamics over tactical weapons, so-called, in Europe is really the question. It's not I don't think there's a lot of military salience there one way or the other. It's important to Russia that they take that position, and I certainly would not expect there to be anything like a reciprocal non-strategic nuclear weapons deal in Europe anytime soon, precisely because, partly because it's important to the Western Europeans that the U.S. be so symbolically coupled to their defense, but most of all because, frankly, tactical weapons are vastly important in the Russian conception of how it is that deterrence relationships need to be approached.
Coming down.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. Your point about deterrence, I'm not so sure. 1998, India and Pakistan explode nuclear weapons. Shortly afterward, you have the Kargil incident. That doesn't strike me as deterrence. That was provoked by Pakistan. You mentioned Israel deterring. How then do you explain what Iran is doing? Not only are the Iranians evidently undeterred, they are purposely provoking Israel gratuitously at the same time with the policy of Holocaust denial. So I could give some more examples, but one of the concerns I have is that we've become too accustomed to this idea of deterrence, but it seems to be breaking down now.
I would certainly urge us not to be complacent about. I mean, I'm certainly not amongst those, and there are a few who think that frankly, more nuclear weapons in more countries' hands is probably better in stabilizing overall. I certainly don't agree with that. Part of my point is that all deterrent relationships are not created equal, and that we may be in something of a conceptual trap if we think of deterrence solely in terms of the ways in which a sort of two-party game stabilized the superpower world for so long. There may be lots of, sort of deterrent relationships around the world that in fact are dysfunctional for very complicated reasons. They probably, in my view, are going to be very idiosyncratic and contextual relationships, and we're going to really miss something and perhaps have terrible, terrible difficulties if we don't understand those idiosyncrasies. So in a sense, I take your point. What I think is probably equally a mistake, though, would be to rule out something, some cousin of nuclear deterrence as a potential way to help maintain stability in a world of many fewer nuclear weapons and perhaps of zero nuclear weapons. I think one should never say never about anything. I'm unwilling to say that deterrence is an unqualified good, and I'm unwilling to say that it is an unqualified evil. We just got to be really smart about this stuff, and it's going to be challenging.
Page 18.
Oh dear.
Henry's
quick. You got to watch out for him.
Well, seems like not everybody else is an optimist. Maybe you are too. This is really remarkable stuff. The heart of what I see that's innovative in this paper is on these pages 18 and 19, and it's this rather lengthy discussion of what you call Countervailing Response, or CR. Do I have that right? Reconstitution. By the way, the administration once approached me with the idea of something like this about 4 years ago. And after I went through it with them, they wisely backed away from publicly getting into it. But this paragraph here, who, for example, should be permitted to have this capability to reconstitute, perhaps it should be roughly, I'm paraphrasing, those that are in the P5, roughly. Am I right?
I mean, I tossed that out. I mean, the whole point is that this needs to be thought through. I'm not proposing that these are definitive answers, but
I think what's so frightening about the spread of these weapons capabilities is that probably isn't going to happen. That what you're going to get is a lot of folks that you're going to have to look over your shoulder at constantly. Well, I think it's already begun. Mm-hmm. It's now no longer 5, it's at least 8 now. And with the enthusiasm for making fuel everywhere and boiling water with fission products and things and training everybody up and making financing cheap, another 20, 30 years it'll be more than 8. The signal-to-noise ratio of these activities, I think, needs to be examined really carefully. And I think our toleration for the amount of activities that could result in nuclear weapons being tested or developed or deployed or used, I think we need to get a handle on those metrics right away, because I don't think it's going to be as simple as this. I mean, to paraphrase you, actually, there's a paper out there that I drafted which suggests that is some of the same points you're making. But as you get even 10 years out from here, you're going to have lots of countries basically second-guessing what each other is doing in a way they currently don't do. So I don't know that this has a fix so much as I think we need to have better metrics for when things become totally unmanageable. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting very close. And certainly this is a great idea, but it's not terribly realistic, I don't think. I mean, it's kind of like what people were arguing before the First World War, that if enough people in Europe were arming up, they wouldn't go to war with one another because they could know that they could get hurt if they went to war, but somehow it would be a countervailing force against the real problem, which were Slavs and yellow people. And it didn't work. It just didn't work. There was just 70 years of war.
Well, if I've suggested either in my talk or in this paper that I regard this as an easy fix, and I've failed in my aim because I don't think that, I toss it out as something that needs to be a part of how we think about the challenge. Whether it ends up being a part of the solution is very much an open question that I'm in no position to answer, but frankly I think it needs a whole lot more study. Perkovich and Acton in their Delphi paper talk about, for instance, and this is it brings up the 1914 residences that you just mentioned, worry about this idea of countervailing reconstitution from a crisis stability perspective. What does it mean what would it mean to have a world in which there might be some sort of game theoretical incentives in time of crisis for people to start turning those keys again, for fear that somebody else will steal a march on them. There could easily be some crisis stability concerns that arise from this. I mean, there are lots of issues, and I don't mean to suggest that this is easy or simple. It may be to some extent unavoidable, and that is where I think you and I agree, and that is that the proliferation of raw capabilities, for example, fissile material production around the world, may be creating to some extent these dynamics for better or worse anyway, whether we like it or not. And even if we try to create a world with a fairly confined set of CR possessor capabilities, we may not be able to keep that box closed particularly well. So, frankly, we may have to struggle with these dynamics and with how it is to even conceptualize a world in which these things are all happening simultaneously and people are looking over their shoulders, as you suggest. We may be stuck with the problem anyway. If we are going to be stuck with it, let's try to at least explore whether it can be made into a virtue rather than a unremitting catastrophe.
I'll stop, but there's just 2 observations. One, you might not want to press on the accelerator to get to this exciting world. You might want to go slower, and we are actually paying extra to get there sooner. With World Bank loans.
What do you mean in terms of what nuclear power capabilities?
Yes,
and
we are
things, right?
subsidizing it, it looks like. That's the new thought. The second thing is the point of departure for thinking about this might be the Atchison-Lilienthal report, where they talk about bombing people if they look like they're moving towards nuclear development.
I love Ashes and Lilienthal and the Baruch era debates, in part because they are so wonderfully interesting, a combination of serious and far-sighted strategic good sense and naive optimism about how to solve the problems that they raise. I mean, they're really great reading. I'd encourage anybody who's got a lot of time on their hands to go back and read through stuff from that period. A lot of the dilemmas that we face today were precisely foreseen, even if the remedies that were proposed were ones that didn't prove workable even then and are very, very difficult to even conceive of now. It doesn't help us solve these problems, but these dilemmas aren't new. You're quite right.
Sam Wells here at the center. Chris, in your excellent presentation, you did not mention the very significant problem of theft or misuse, unauthorized use of nuclear materials or weapons. And in light of the fact that these technologies are becoming increasingly available, would not the U.S. strategic posture be best served with a minimal deterrence and a significant reconstitution capability, trying to keep everyone's number of weapons at the lowest possible number, but us having the capacity to reconstitute?
Very possibly. Frankly, I think our, and here's where I stick my neck out a little bit against my former colleagues, perhaps. I think our numbers could easily be, significantly lower than they are right now. Where, I don't know. And that's where the real debate's going to come in. And how low I think it may be possible to go will depend in part upon, whether support can be assured and maintained for some of the things that would help make that step less painful for us. I would be much less interested in going lower if Congress continues to starve the Reliable Replacement Warhead program. I would be very much less interested in going lower if we were unable to proceed with complex modernization further. If we fail to keep up a robust non-nuclear conventional capability, then again that's an equation changer. So details matter, but I think you make a very good point. I would worry less, however, about aggregate numbers in the world than I would, I think, about who has the capability. It is probably more worrisome from a leakage perspective to unauthorized folks to have a lot more players, even if they have very small numbers of actual weapons in being, than it would be to have a couple of very responsible players with really good security over well commanded, controlled, and manageable forces. We don't necessarily have. Yeah, that's a false dichotomy because we're not really faced with that choice, sadly. But who has it? Frankly, let's be honest. Who has what makes a darn big difference.
Okay, I'm having some questions. Yes, Laura.
Yes, Laura Holgate from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Thanks for your excellent, provocative presentation. One comment and one question. One comment is just to reassure you that the quartet, or the four statesmen in their as the classic disarmers here, are well aware of the complexities. And I think if you look at the steps, you'll see, and under their vision, you'll see that they take a lot of account for that. And I would just highlight that a lot of research is going into some of the very questions you've identified, so watch this space. Question, in your presentation, you hinted at a model of looking at balancing behavior that might come against either the first rearmor or future armors. And if you look at what decisions were made by those who did abandon nuclear weapons by choice, each a little bit special case, but in all four cases, if you look at Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and South Africa, they all decided they were better off security-wise without nukes, presumably because of some kind of a balancing behavior or some kind of expectation of what they might have of their own security posture if they did keep the nukes that they found themselves with. Wondering if that's the concept that you were thinking of, or can you expand a little bit on this question of balancing against nuclear rearmors?
But I think that's part of it. Those cases, though, are I'm still struggling in my own mind about what to make about the sort of givers up historically. The givers up love to take a lot of credit for having given them up. And I've talked with Abdul Minty from South Africa many times about this. He and I see it a little bit differently on these questions. South Africa is the greatest, sort of most intriguingly funny example because they love to take credit these days for having given up nuclear weapons. The one country that independently developed them and yet gave them up. The Central Asians, I mean, in a way, there's sort of a sui generis case that maybe they don't deserve. I mean, it's a great decision, but, they didn't build them in the first place. They couldn't have maintained them. They didn't have the infrastructure. These things were just sitting on their soil. Okay, especially if you can get a lot of goodies for getting rid of them, why not? The South Africans is a much more interesting case. And South African sources are very divided about how to characterize this. I have talked to former apartheid regime officials who regard the decision to get rid of their weapons as having been a sort of classic realpolitik decision. Well, we got them, so the argument goes, because we were worried about this sort of total onslaught of Soviet-dominated, monolithic, revolutionary fervor coming down through Africa, and we wanted to be able to deter, this sort of Soviet imperial monolith at the end of the day, or perhaps use weapons to leverage intervention by the West on behalf of South Africa. If you don't help us out in this final struggle at the end of days here in south of the Limpopo, we'll have to use the nuclear weapons. There was these sort of they would regard this as having been a sort of strategic calculation in classic realpolitik style of why they needed them in the first place, and that therefore the decision to give them up was the result of glasnost and the collapse of the Soviet Union and so forth. Not a bad argument. The other side of this is that you can't escape looking at the domestic political context either, and this is where Abdul and I do agree, and that is that a huge factor in giving up of the apartheid regime giving up its nuclear weapons was to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of a black liberation successor government. They wanted Nelson Mandela to not have the bomb. Hugely important, very hard to talk about. But of course the response to that is, what kind of an example does that set? Neither one of those explanations, and they may both be true to some extent, neither one of those explanations gives us a lot to work with in terms of programmatic policy incentives in achieving disarmament. If it is sort of the realpolitik systemic change thing, then the answer to disarmament more broadly is to have, it goes back to the sort of the wild hope for the great fortuitous, mysterious, transfiguring thing that will make world conflict a thing of the past, and therefore nuclear weapons will be easy to get rid of. That's not a strategy. That's just a hope. Great, good for you. Let's think about what we can actually do. It doesn't necessarily, if the Soviet Union happens to collapse and your image of the total onslaught disappears, then you can get rid of your weapons. Okay, fine. It doesn't get you very far in terms of where we think we should try to make the world go right now. The other competing explanation, which is to say it was a decision of the apartheid regime to get rid of their weapons so that the blacks didn't get them, that doesn't help you much either, because frankly that's a regime change argument. You extrapolate from that, you say, well, the solution to nuclear weapons dilemmas is to get rid of the nasty regimes that pursue them. I might be willing in certain circumstances to entertain that argument, but to generalize it as a principle would be rather dangerous, I should think. So frankly, I don't know what to make of those cases. They're hard.
Do you want to say any more about your balancing theory?
Frankly, the biggest point I want to make about balancing theory is that we don't have a good way to even think about balancing theory yet. And that's really, I think, the research agenda, the conceptual agenda for anyone who cares about these issues, is to frankly develop the toolkit that will let us have the kind of discussions that you're asking me to have, and I'm afraid I'm not in a position yet to do that. Though if I can find a lot of grant money someplace, maybe we can talk. So anyway. You notice how I said that to NTI.
Okay. The guy in the back row there.
Thank you. Excuse me. James Acton from the Carnegie Endowment.
The man himself. How do you do?
I would absolutely agree with your exhortation to think about the details, and I think that's absolutely right. What I wanted to ask you about specifically was, from your experience in the US government, what you think the saleability of the idea of countervailing reconstitution capabilities are, specifically to kind of two key constituencies who would need to be convinced that they're good things. The first one are non-nuclear weapon states, who I think intuitively would think that this was a plot by the weapon states to keep their weapons forever, which it kind of is. But do you think the US government could make the argument that it is better to have that it would be a waypoint on the way to disarmament, or not could it make it, but could it successfully make the argument to non-nuclear weapon states and have them view countervailing reconstitution capability as being a good thing? And then the second constituency is the US labs, who you mentioned, but who even today make the argument that not enough money is being spent on them, it's becoming increasingly difficult to fabricate pits and to fabricate nuclear weapons. Do you think that they could be sold on the idea of countervailing reconstitution capability rather than physical weapons?
Very good questions. And let me thank you and George, by the way, for your treatment of the CR issue in your Adelphi paper. At the moment, it's the only thing out there in any detail at all. And you do raise, as I indicate in the paper here, you guys raise the right questions. In terms of these questions, saleability to the rest of the world is one of the major challenges. I think you're quite right. It would precisely be seen as a way. I mean, one of the big pushes, one of the emotive impulses, I think, for disarmament thinking nowadays is frankly less an appreciation or less a conceptual model of strategic stability in a livable world than it is a sort of visceral reaction against the injustice of a world of haves and have-nots in this most obvious and dramatic arena. CR wouldn't really quite answer the mail in that respect. So I guess the question then would be the degree to which supporters of disarmament could be sold on this as a best available. I mean, in theory, policymakers around the world are quite accustomed to settling for less than the ideal in preference to getting, nothing or a terribly bad outcome. Is that possible in this? It's a very good question. I mean, obviously, I don't know the answer, but you're quite right to ask it. Saleability of it would be very challenging, and there, you would not be able to avoid a world in which there were, in a sense, proliferation pressures, even with respect to the kind of technological diffusion that Henry was talking about and worrying about quite rightly. You would certainly see pressures for ENR technology and things like that continue. Precisely, I mean, maybe sub silentio, but precisely in order to spread the wealth from a countervailing reconstitution perspective. Very challenging, and we're having a hell of a time controlling that technology as it is. Hard. As to the USG and the labs, and one of the things that I think any serious study of countervailing reconstitution needs is a real hard-nosed programmatic look at, let's assume for the sake of argument that this is a good doctrine and a useful thing for a disarmed world that you should pursue. If that's the case, what exactly would it in fact entail from a sort of programmatic, fiscal, human capital, infrastructural perspective? I mean, these are debates that the U.S. government and many other governments, I suspect, face all the time. I mean, you saw the Navy a few years ago buy 2 or 3, whatever it was, these fancy, super high-tech, best submarine ever built Seawolf submarines, not because the Navy wanted them, they didn't care at that point, but because it was deemed very important to keep building submarines for the moment, because otherwise when the next generation of submarines comes along, all your submarine makers will have retired and you won't be able to build anything. So in order to be able to have any future nuclear submarine capacity, it was deemed necessary to buy what arguably was sort of pretty extraordinarily wasteful indulgence of these submarines that the Navy didn't want, that were designed to fight a war that we no longer anticipated fighting. The theory was that was the right call in context because the alternative was giving up that capability for the country forever. And these issues are, certainly not new ones to the labs. Particularly, I mean, I think you guys raised the point in the Adelphi paper, which in my impression is dealing with the labs is very true. It is only partly about, budgets and equipment and facilities. It's in fact, if anything, the toughest nut to crack is the human capital challenge. The folks who did this for careers are, there are not nearly so many of them as there used to be. They're, in some, many cases retiring. In some cases, the deepest expertise is dying. And it's very hard to bring in new blood and to train them up. You're quite right. I think your phrasing in the paper, if I recall, maybe I saw somebody else's work. This is it's largely an apprenticeship art. This is not something where you can sort of buy a textbook on how to do the kind of really super duper fancy nuclear engineering and design that's involved in a state-of-the-art weapon. It's something that largely has to be learned by doing it through on-the-job training. How to keep that kind of a capability alive over time when you in fact don't have any nuclear weapons and there is no natural, the notion that you need to go through the considerable trouble that maintaining a CR capability would entail when you don't have any nuclear weapons. I mean, the political dynamics of keeping that going over time with budgets and so forth would be very tough. This needs a lot more looking at, don't get me wrong. I don't mean this as, again, to repeat what I said to Henry, this is not a panacea that I'm suggesting. It's a way to, something that needs to be thought about as part of the puzzle, but it's not going to solve all of our challenges.
Carl Lundgren from Jonah Speaks. I'm glad somebody pointed out that pages 18 and 19 are the most interesting part of your paper today. And I did read the Perkovich and Acton paper on this issue of countervailing reconstitution. And I kind of had a question about feasibility. supposedly, let's say 5, 10, whatever powers are going to have this capacity to rebuild nuclear bombs, and the rest of the world does not have this capacity. But somebody out there wants to cheat. How long would it take for them to build a bomb? Let's say it's 3 years. But these other people, they find out about it after 6 months, and so then that's the signal to start building. How long does it take them to rebuild? Is it 3 months? Is it 3 years if we've lost all the human capital? Or does anybody have any numbers to fill in all the details here and do the numbers work out? Because, if it takes 3 years to match somebody else who's cheating and they've already got, say, a 5-year head start, that's not a good ratio. But if it only takes you 3 months and you've already caught them, then it might be something that's feasible. Setting aside whether it's desirable or saleable, is it feasible? And I was wondering if anybody, you or somebody else maybe, either has the numbers or could create the numbers that would show that it's feasible or perhaps not feasible.
Well, my temptation here is to defer to my colleague from Los Alamos, but let me say, just as I see it, it's not even a knowable answer, because the extent to which it takes a certain amount of time is going to depend upon what you maintain over, how much effort and energy do you put into those kind of programmatic human and physical capital maintenance efforts. Do you maintain? I'm sure it's possible to maintain an infrastructure that's capable of going into production tomorrow morning. Would we be willing to go to the trouble that it would take to keep things on that kind of a restorative basis? Might be hard. How far you lag in that is going to have a big impact upon what kind of timely warning you need of breakout. There may be issues of how much timely warning you can expect. If you can't be confident that the verification regime provides really good timely warning, you almost have to go whole hog in terms of a very expensive and difficult infrastructural maintenance capability. These things are all interrelated variables, and to some extent it's going to depend a lot upon whether you can crack the verification nut, how much, what the pain tolerance is of your domestic system in terms of budgetary and other kinds of resources and attention to keep the productive infrastructure alive. These are all going to reflect and influence each other in ways that you probably can't predict until you just live it out, which is another reason why this is such a daunting challenge, why any of this is such a daunting challenge, and why the skeptics of disarmament often have so much fun in pointing these things out to those of us who tend to be attracted to the idea. So. Oh, by the way, sorry, let me just say one thing, not on that subject, but if you're looking for mining this paper of sort of tidbits to put in your thinking caps, I would suggest footnote 7, which I wrote at about 2:50 last night, in which I raised the idea. It builds off of a musing on the role of ballistic missile defenses and how that might affect both post-disarmament stability and the challenges of getting to zero in the first place. And one of the things that I toss out, just as food for thought, is the idea of whether it might be possible to imagine a world in which there are robust missile and other types of defenses, at least as amongst today's weapons possessors. And those possessors have come down to very small numbers of actual warheads, numbers that are below the level at which those defenses can defeat an attack. In other words, so that the nuclear deterrence has ceased to operate amongst the possessor states, but they remain possessor states with very small numbers of warheads in a system of robust defenses. Arguably, that might provide two benefits. One, as I suggest in here, the fact that some weapons would continue to exist, and therefore that productive infrastructures would continue to exist, but that they lost their deterrent value as amongst possessors, would, as a functional matter, be zero. This is why I think it was functional zero as opposed to true zero. Functionally, the number of nuclear weapons in the world would be zero because those who possess them would not, in fact, any longer exist in deterrent relationships vis-a-vis each other, at least, because of the presence of defensive systems. So you would achieve some of the benefits of disarmament, but you would do so in a way that did not impose the verification costs, for example, of the nearly perfect verification regime that would be required if you tried to maintain true zero. And on the other hand, the continued existence of very, very small numbers of weapons in the hands of those possessor states might arguably provide some kind of a breakout or proliferation deterrent capability against those countries that did not possess them and that did not possess those robust defensive systems, because even those small number of weapons would be very useful against anybody who decided to challenge the regime, who did not happen to A, possess them, or possess countervailing weapons, or B, possess any of the robust defenses that I was referring to. So it's conceivable, perhaps, maybe, don't know, love to hear people think about it, it's conceivable that you might be able to have a world of more than zero, but in which nuclear deterrent relationships had largely disappeared in the context of a robust defensive architecture amongst today's possessors. Anyway, provocative food for thought. But anyway, that's not really for discussion now, because I haven't thought about it more than to put down for footnote 7. But anyway, things to chew on.
Hi, I'm Dan Horner from Platts, and I wanted to ask about the interaction between nonproliferation and disarmament. In your different scenarios for disarmament, how did you weigh in, or did you weigh in, the potential impact on nonproliferation diplomacy? I mean, as you know better than just about anybody, the non-weapon states complain about the weapon states' failure under Article 6 to disarm and say that's a necessary part of the NPT bargain. So did you assume that's sort of a reflexive talking point, and then actual disarmament wouldn't really have any effect on nonproliferation, or did you assume that actually would create greater confidence and allow nonproliferation measures to move more smoothly, or what did you assume, and how did that factor into your analysis? Thanks.
It didn't factor a lot into the analysis in this paper. My own view on the subject is that, while it's certainly not a reason its potential effect upon nonproliferation diplomatic dynamics is not a reason to do disarmament itself if the strategic logic of disarmament doesn't make sense. There will be those who say that because it affects nonproliferation policy, therefore that's the reason to disarm. Well, that's maybe a little overstatement, but clearly, in my view, they are connected to the degree that there are those out there who will be more easily enticed into collaborative, cooperative work against would-be proliferators, to the extent that they perceive there to be some hope of real movement on disarmament. It's safe to say, I think, that it has been harder as a matter of nonproliferation compliance diplomacy to elicit cooperative effort, because there is this sort of leitmotif out there in certain circles that, in effect, the N5 don't really deserve our help in controlling proliferation because they're not doing what they ought to do. On any number of different levels, I will fight that view on its merits, but silly or otherwise, it's widely held. Counterproductive and dangerous or otherwise, it is widely held, and that therefore, talk about disarmament in apparent seriousness is itself, I suppose, useful from a nonproliferation diplomatic perspective. That may have played some role in the degree to which some of the N5 are willing to talk about disarmament now. Now, that can't be the end of the game. One should only really talk about disarmament if one thinks it makes some sense. So I hope that it's not just that, and don't think it's just that, but it's probably a factor. Oh dear.
Scott Davis, State Department. You referred earlier to your, I think I can probably call it glee at not having to clear your writings now in the interagency.
You can probably tell from my discussion in the past
I will
few
just
minutes.
echo that by saying I'm really glad I don't have to get this cleared in the interagency. Chris, from your...
I might in fact recognize portions of it
Yeah,
from
indeed,
things
I do.
that failed to get cleared in the interagency.
Indeed.
But I will not say which portions, just for the record.
From your NPT diplomacy, how little credit we often get for the remarkable reductions we've made in nuclear weapons.
Gracefully so, yeah.
And often a corollary to that is, why can't the United States reiterate its commitment to nuclear disarmament? And that comes up in various ways, whether it's one of the 13 steps or whether it's some reference to Article 6, et cetera. And of course, we do it in some ways, but I think we keep hearing that refrain. And now, of course, we have an incoming administration that may do something like that. But in the discussion today, we've, I think, appropriately focused on sort of the long term, and some of it rather theoretical. But just looking at the near term and the possible eventuality that we might get some kind of high level or certainly more clear recommitment to Article 6 of the NPT to disarmament. I just wondered whether you think a step like that really would have an impact on the evolution toward zero, or whether it's more purely a political and tactical matter. A reiteration, does that mean something now and working in that direction, or is it more symbolic?
My suspicion is it's actually more symbolic in the sense that I'm not persuaded that the lack of that sort of declaratory policy, I mean, frankly, there's no lack of that declaratory policy, at least on behalf of the United States. As I indicated in my paper, we're not really the problem here anyway. We're a convenient and politically correct whipping boy on these subjects. But frankly, as you and I know, because you and I did it for the last 2 years, the U.S. talks itself blue in the face, recommitting itself to Article 6 and to the goal of disarmament. That's made a shockingly small difference in the diplomatic equation, and that may itself tell us something about where some of these other parties are really coming from. There's a good ratio of opportunism and, frankly, just anti-American fun in poking your finger in the eye of the superpower in these respects. If we were to become gung-ho, extravagant supporters of disarmament, you might see some very interestingly amusing dynamics of people in the diplomatic community shuffling about madly in order to come up with rationalizations for how to suddenly demur. Who knows? But it's not worth going down that road unless you want to go down that road anyway. So doing it just to expose the hypocrisy in so many circles probably isn't very advisable, though it would be fun. Frankly, I don't think that the U.S. is the challenge here at all. And as I indicate somewhere in the paper, to some extent, to the degree that the U.S. really did come to be seen as an enthusiastic proponent of disarmament, you might actually help entrench the positions of some other players even more strongly. If it were up to me, if I could wave a magic wand and make all nuclear weapons, or frankly all WMD, go away, if I were speaking on behalf of the United States government, which I'm not, I would say, yay, verily, bring it on. I can think of nothing, better, frankly, from a U.S. national interest perspective than not having a world in which those things threatened us and our forces, and let's be candid, our freedom of action in the world in the way they do today. If indeed Alagapa is right that nuclear weapons are these days weapons of the weak, the U.S. is the easy case. We can get rid of the darn things, maybe. But at least we have the only saleable case, I suspect, amongst anybody who has them right now. It's going to be much harder for the others, precisely to the degree that it's not hard to us. And so, frankly, the challenge here, although the diplomatic rhetoric is always to poke fun at the United States for being the bad guy, the U.S. isn't the problem. And frankly, the U.S. isn't even really the solution, in the sense that these things need to be growing organically out of strategic calculations of other countries. We're not the hard case, and anyone who pretends that we are is frankly not very serious about addressing this problem, because it's not going to be solved except in the minds and the strategic calculations of a lot of other players over which we don't have the kind of influence that we are presumed to have. So I regard as a barometer of the seriousness of disarmament's proponents, frankly, the degree to which they engage in the kind of sort of semi-hysterical America baiting that we've seen so much of in our past couple of years. It's a sad commentary on the state of modern arms control diplomacy, but I fear that there's a lot of truth in what I've just said.
Yes.
See, I could never have gotten that cleared.
Scott, here.
Thanks. Elaine Grossman from Global Security Newswire. Just wondering if you might comment on the Pentagon's development currently underway for conventional prompt global strike weapons. I'm wondering if that sort of is a trend you'd encourage for the near term, what implications you see for the potential reduction of nuclear weapons in the U.S. force at all, or if that's something you would discourage because you think it's premature.
Good question. And this isn't an issue that I followed recently, although I was familiar with the so-called conventional Trident thing a few years ago. Personally, I think it's something that I am attracted to. It represents one of the many facets of moving into post-nuclear weapons ways of thinking about strategic power and deterrence. It's the kind of thing that it's one of the aspects of the nuclear posture review in the early Bush administration that I liked and that has been very difficult to move forward on. I mean, James Wertz's piece in Alagapa's book is pretty good at laying out the degree to which, frankly, some of the really interesting new thinking that the Bush administration engaged in on how to reconceptualize a post-Cold War way of thinking about nuclear weapons, frankly, have not been implemented because they've been, killed for financial or political disinterest, if not opposition in Congress. I would like to see, frankly, more exploration of how it is that we move beyond nuclear weapons, and that kind of prompt strike thing is one really interesting potential avenue for doing that. Now, it doesn't mean it's an easy, it raises some real challenges. I mean, the Trident issue is one of them. one of the more obvious and intractable ones. What is the potential impact upon continuing relationships of nuclear security, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and perhaps China, if all of a sudden, a missile rises out of, who knows where, the South Atlantic or something, headed towards, it may be headed toward a tent complex in Waziristan, which, frankly, would be good if the intel's good, but it, looks like it's headed towards, Beijing or Moscow for the first half of its flight, and to the extent that anybody still maintains early warning systems capable of notifying them of that kind of stuff, that could be really worrisome. So there's a massive operational nut that needs to be cracked. Maybe it has been, but I've lost track of this program. But there are clearly things that need to be wrinkled out. Ironed out, I should say. Wrinkles that need to be ironed out. But I do applaud and encourage people thinking in terms of how it is that that deterrent type relationships can be maintained and built and thought about in a world that do not require the continued existence of nuclear weapons. So that may or may not be the specific remedy. I sort of liked it at the time. I don't know what's become of it. But that kind of thing, I think, is where our heads should be going, at least in terms of think pieces. And if we like what we think, then it may be, something may come out of that that's very profoundly useful.
I'm sorry, but we're out of time. For those who were on the remainder on my list, forgive me. Our next meeting will be December 5th. Michael Crapon will speak. But please join me in thanking Chris Ford for a extremely useful afternoon.
Thanks for having me.